Hello, everybody. We should be live. I'm just popping onto YouTube here to make sure that the stream is happening. Who have
Hello,
we got with
everybody.
us today? Well, I have with me today a face that you may not have seen for quite a while. It's Kevin.
They pulled me out of retirement.
And customarily, I am in my spacesuit today because we're doing a sci-fi.
Is it a sci-fi, Gareth? Or is it something much more?
Well, yeah. Is it just narrative fiction, sci-fi,
Sci-fi?
bit
A
of thriller,
mystery,
yeah.
thriller?
And yeah, okay, I won't drop any spoilers on that front. But there's something that comes up later that kind of ties into that mixed vibe of it all. But yeah, everybody sound off for us in the comments there who's viewing. We'll give others a minute or two just to get in before we kick off. But it's, of course, What's the Score Live? And this time, Constance by Matthew FitzSimmons. Now, Kevin, I believe this is a book that you actually picked up.
Yes.
Are you a fan of the author himself?
I am a fan of the author. I haven't read him in a while, but this is a new release that came out, I believe, in this September. So it's kind of one of the newer books that I was able to pick up and read through there. So I am familiar, and it's he's usually very well read. He has a pretty strong following out there with his crew of audience.
So what's the general sort of content of his writing? Is it mostly sci-fi or airing on thrillers? Or
yeah, it's a lot of a futuristic thriller, sci-fi, a little bit of a mix of those things. He doesn't really. I don't think he has a huge, strong pinned down genre that he focused on. So he's a little bit more of a floater, but tendency towards futuristic. Maybe a little bit of mental gymnastic style writing, where you have to, picks a topic and you have to think about it pretty hard to try to gather.
So food for thought.
Yes.
And anybody in the audience there who's watching us right now, I know we kept this one a little bit of a surprise, so it was only revealed today. And do we have any Matthew FitzSimmons fans with us who are pleasantly surprised at the reveal? Or not? As the case may be.
And we try to find a variety of different types of authors, different audiences that they focus on. Because here with AutoCrit, we really try to focus on not just one thing, but everything in the world of fiction.
Indeed, and we're always open to suggestions as well. So
Yes.
That's one of the things. Make sure if you're watching, whether you're watching right now or you catch up on a replay of this, pop it in the comments. Let us know what you would like to actually see, and we'll pull that around for you. But okay, I guess we can get rolling. Well, we've got Peter in the comments. Never heard of him. Okay.
Well, you will now after this.
You will indeed.
You will.
And this particular book, of course, we'll try not to dig too much into it because this is a recent release. I believe, Kevin, when we were talking, it basically shot straight to number one again on release. Matthew is, of course, a best-selling author worldwide. I think it's a Wall Street Journal list bestseller. So yeah, big stuff. So we'll try not to dig into too much in terms of the minutiae and not dig too deep into the book. So avoid spoilers as much as possible.
Thank you, Gareth. That's for me, I guess.
Well, yes, I know Kevin's actually reading it right now. So. At this point here, we will start as we always do, I guess. Let's see if we can have a few guesses of what the summary score is likely to be. Again, think about it. I can see John in the comments there. Didn't know the author, but it sounds like a category. Yeah, I really like to read and to write. And definitely sounds interesting. True, yeah. And what do we think the score comes out like? We can see our fingerprint there. Obviously, pacing momentum, 404, very, very low. That's a nicely low number in there. But where we're standing out, strong writing is pretty much our top category here, 12,500 indicators. So there's a lot going on there, followed by word choice and repetition. But overall, doesn't look packed out across the board. If Solici's just 79, you might be quite close, Solisa. $76, $79. Yep, definitely around the 70s. And yes, now, of course, comparing at the moment, we are comparing to general fictions. This is just kind of benchmarking this novel against every other novel, regardless of genre, that's in the system. So that brings us to a 72.51.
Surprisingly low for somebody of such success, but I think you're going to hit on this as we go, Garrett. That this is kind of an unusual, style of writing a little bit.
Yeah, there are some strange things that we'll get into that work in different contexts, but may go against what you could consider best practices. And of course, some authors will get away with that. Others will not, depending on your stature in the market, more or less. But I guess looking at something like the 72.51, even for a modern novel, can seem kind of shocking. But again, I kind of get shocked putting through some of like Stephen King's older books tend to score pretty low. Well, kind of quote unquote low, because it's not exactly a qualitative score, but certainly low 70s. You just kind of whoa, didn't expect that low. But yeah, that's where we are, 72.51. So we'll take a run here through some of the additional reports, see if there's any interesting things to pull out, and of course, chat about. So moving on from the summary report, where I always like to start. It's going to be dialogue. Dialogue tags. It's a nice spread. Mostly said and asked, about 3/4, with about 1/4 of them being others. And what others do we have? So we can see here said and asked are both marked in red. They're going to be determined as having been overused. I think this book is around 100,000 words.
Yeah, right, 102, I think.
And this it really just indicates that although, yes, said and asked are the ones you want to use, compared to the general landscape of all the books ever written that are inside AutoCrit, this one's a little heavier on dialogue. There's going to be more people speaking than you would generally see. So these aren't much of a concern for us. It's good to see, obviously, when these are the highest, even if they're red, you still want them the highest. But we're looking at things like we have replied, demanded, answered, agreed, admitted, snapped, repeated.
And interestingly enough, Gareth, as I was reading through it, I noticed, because the book has a lot of duplicates of humans, right? This is a cloning. Cloning plays a big role in that. And in it, you have one clone talking to another clone that's the same person. So by default, they're forced to use said and asked a lot more and use the person's name or the other Constance or this Constance or Constance number one. So just to try to keep track of who is speaking, the nature of the story requires him to use more dialogue tags, just so the reader doesn't. It's kind of an interesting thing to fall into, but it makes sense that all the characters, when you're talking to clones of yourself, you have to kind of be a little more descriptive to your audience to who exactly is speaking.
Yeah, that's very true, because you could also think of it in terms of, well, I guess if you didn't think about it enough, you would think, well, it's just like any other dialogue exchange. I just, as long as I bounce them back and forth, in between lines, then people can follow it. But you also have to think about the mental picture that people are painting for themselves, and that can easily blend. I'm imagining Michael Fassbender in Alien Covenant, when there's the two versions of him as the robots.
Yeah, you're talking to yourself, it gets confusing, right?
Yeah, you're just imagining the same face back and forth. It's like, oh wait, who was who?
Exactly.
So our removals here, you can see it gets quite extreme in the asked, certainly on general fiction here, with 193 and remove about 113. Most of everything else is quite low in terms of the removals. Parroted is one that people just don't really like at all. And said 586 uses about 153. So, roughly 1/4 of those or so to head out of there. But everything else is not a big cleanup job.
Yeah, for the asked though, this is a mystery thriller. It has quite a big element in it where the main character is literally asking a lot of questions as she's trying to figure out what's going on. So that's interesting. That it popped up so much just based on the type of the nature of the story itself. Once again, the main character is trying to figure out what's going on. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's naturally going to happen. I'd be tempted, if I were tackling this myself, just to focus on some of these real alternatives.
Yeah.
And again, it's not nuking all of them, really, except for in the case of Parroted, Commiserated. Whereas we have Segued, that could work in context. But the said and asked, best left alone as they are until afterwards, I think.
Yeah.
Sticking in with dialogue, we'll move into adverbs in dialogue. Now, of course, this is adverbs attached to dialogue tags, he said shrewdly. And 5% overall in the entire book. And we're only overused in warily, rhetorically, genuinely, and defiantly. So you get some leeway. There's definitely room for the occasional adverb attached to your tags, but you don't really want to overdo it. And I think this is actually a really good result because, again, the general use is low, and the removals themselves are low in terms of workload. If you were editing this to fix it yourself, it's not a huge issue. But you can see there's quite a lot of different ones here that have been used that are not kind of seen as offenders, more or less. So good marks there for Matthew. Adverbs themselves, if we step out of dialogue, are again in a good realm. So we're between good and great overall. And here's our most frequent adverbs that are popping up throughout. I've got really, already, exactly, simply, actually, anyway, clearly, eventually. So quite a mix this time around when we get to actual adverbs. But again, looking at that in the context of the comparison there, we're not up in the red or anything. What's our heaviest here? So we have really, about 47. And really the one thing I like to do, and there I go saying really, is again, your general use of adverbs will probably show up in dialogue. People talk with them a lot. And inside the narration, I just like to look out for these, areas where they are actually packed in. You seem to have a nice block of them right away, because we can go all the way through here and not really see, just one here, one there. And then we're just looking for spots where there might be whoa, there we go. That's why the visuals help so much, because it's just like pop, red. And filler words. Anyone think where we might be landing with those?
I think it's high, Gareth. My guess. I'm going out on a limb.
This is a surprise. Quite often a surprise for people, I think, because I tend to find even in really successful published works, filler words often do tend to be higher than you expect. You think, oh, that's one of the easiest things to do. Go through and tidy those up, so there's not going to be so many. When realistically, it's not really all that true. So here we're about to bust through the gauge, hitting up into the excess.
Yeah.
About 418. Various reasons for this to be there, which we can go into, but our main offender is that. Quite frankly,
yeah.
I think it's the one that you'll most often see in people's writing is the word that is the biggest filler word. Now, most of the time, and I'll point this out about this novel, is that might look extreme. You're like, whoa, because it's really, in terms of comparison, it is that amount of that's pushing this gauge all the way up. If we had about 418 to remove, 387 of them are that. So it's really making a huge contribution. And I spent a little time looking at the writing, and you can see here, even in our first few paragraphs, here's a real collection of that. Very, very close. And the thing with that is, as well, many of these sentences, that could be removed, and the sentence still parses, but doing that seems to take away the cadence of Matthew's writing, which is, I don't want to say completely formal, but definitely has that feel to it. Similar to the Golden Compass. Remember, we did that a couple of months ago, I think, and there was a sense of tone to the narrator in that book that required some of these words that, if they were taken away, it would not read anywhere near that author's own voice, if you understand it.
And just that interesting side note, Matthew FitzSimmons taught English literature and theater, so he's of a little bit of a little bit different mindset, perhaps. So he, like, his language style, like you said, is a little bit different and unique in how he puts things together.
He's the thespian tone,
not short for words. But that is somewhat interesting, though. It's still, though, especially when it jumps out from AutoCrit, you can just see it so clearly that I'm not going to say it's a problem, but it's a pattern. The pattern really jumps off the page.
That's true. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. Actually, is not so much being a problem, but a pattern. In writing like this, because I mean, you could look at this and just be completely mindless about it, and say, okay, does that sentence read if I take those out? Yes, it does. All right, I'll delete it. When that may be actually changing the entire voice of your writing.
Mm-hmm.
So stick with it. I would say, from what I've read of this, and certainly looked through in these introductory paragraphs, first couple of chapters, even there's a definite voice coming from the narrator that would not be the same if you took away all of those.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very tough decision to make. But again, at the end of the day, if you're using it and you're editing your own book, you're the artist. You make the decision. If it's not sounding like you, don't change it. Keep true to yourself. And that's why we say sometimes things go against best practices. They're not always hard laws. Speaking of hard laws, or things that some people like to consider hard laws, we have showing versus telling. Now, showing versus telling, of course, everybody probably knows by this point, is often touted as like the number one rule of writing, which is show, don't tell. Make sure to put me in the scene and don't just use light brushes to push me on through. But again, it's not something that is always true. And this book is quite indicative of it. Again, if we look at the indicators in AutoCrit, we're way up in the excess. Definitely hitting the top of the gauge here. Now, the most common indicator that's showing up is the word it. Very, very tough one to deal with this. I know we do have a number of users, I think quite a lot of users, who are working with this report and thinking, well, how can I change the word it? Because it's a very common word, it's literally just referring to things. It happens all the time and everywhere, and almost every sentence in your book might be referencing it in some way, whatever it is. Now, the thing with that is you don't actually have to remove them all. But again, watch out for the visual style that's going on here. And I'll show you why this matters in this report. You can see straight from the beginning, one thing that jumped right out at me was not the fact that the words are highlighted. It's the huge cluster. Everything going on here. And it's it really, really jammed together here in the opening. And that in itself is something that just says to me, as soon as it hits my eyes, is this section is likely telling, because there's so much going on there. Again, why there's indicators packed together. So it doesn't so much matter that it's the word it, it's the fact that we've got tons of all these red indicators sort of jumping right out into your eyes. And I don't think it's particularly spoilery, since we're only in the very beginning of the book here. But yes, once you start reading it, you realize, and we were talking just before we went live about this, because Kevin's actually reading the book right now. He was saying that, yes, literally the first, did you say 3 chapters?
First 3 chapters. The first chapter, she's actually asleep, dreaming. And so not doing there's no action in the first chapter whatsoever, all completely just describing a little bit of world building, describing the character, trying to get into the narrator's head. But there's literally no action. She isn't moved. Her body physically doesn't move in the first chapter at all. And then like second chapter, she kind of go. So from my perspective, the actual thriller part of this book doesn't start till chapter 4 is where the actual action begins.
Wow. And that's, again, going back to the beginning, that's kind of the thing that flies in the face of these, kind of best practice. And it does make you think that, a debut author, for example, trying to land or find a home or representation or something for a novel that starts like this is probably at a much lower chance of that happening than Matthew FitzSimmons. Again, because it just kind of comes with the stature. But you can notice, if you are seeing this on your screen and reading it, that all of this is backstory. And it's very, very much telling, because we're running through a lot of information very quickly. And where it does attempt to evoke things, it simply uses the quickest way to do so. Like, made the apartment smell. You can see smell like back home in Texas. We've got no other information about that, really. And feeling as well, or, you would be in telling mode when you're saying that somebody felt this way. And again, she woke up on Christmas morning feeling low as hell. there's no further context to that. It's not being shown to us why that was, because the author doesn't want to do that. This is all just giving us information. Could potentially be called an infodump, but I don't think it really is. It's more padding out the backstory.
I think it's from the perspective that I read it, it was too like getting into the mindset of the narrator, trying to understand what makes her tick a little bit and getting a personality. So in the first chapter, so her age, the time of year, that she's a singer, a lot of information about this person and how she feels about the world and her outlook before the actual action starts. So it's kind of one of those, it's an interesting way. It's written very well, but it certainly is. And I think the pacing, when we get to it, will show, is really slow at the beginning. But I mean, that's a trade-off you have to make, I guess. If you want to try to really introduce your character and your world in that fashion, your drawback is, of course, there's not much action going on.
Yeah, and I think one thing we were mentioning too is this decision is very much a decision made by the author, because one of the things, if you were to follow a lot of advice, they would say start in medias res, jump right to when things are happening and start with that, which is going to be, as you said, chapter 4. She wakes up and is into the world, and I'm actually a clone, or sort of whatever's going on there. But if she did wake up, the story started with her waking up like that and had no memory and had to learn these things. That's a very different approach to the story than giving us this background to begin with, so that, as you said, we actually have some idea or context of who the character is before she wakes up.
Yeah, and then when she wakes up, right? So you know the character very well. You're invested as a reader in that character, and then when you finally meet the clone who didn't go through some of this stuff, you notice the subtle differences between version 1 versus version 2 because you know version 1 so well. But if you had been introduced to both at the same time, that wouldn't have such a dramatic effect later on down because you're so close to the main character is by this point. The problem is you have to make sure your reader doesn't drop off, of course, and actually stays invested. So it's a gamble, but it's a gamble that could pay off if you're willing to actually watch like watching a movie or whatever to the end. Like, you get past a couple of slow parts, but because of that, you have a more well-rounded appreciation for who the main character is.
Yeah. That's what I guess a difference in that build-up as well. It's a feeling like a slower introduction versus an opening scroll. That's just full of information.
But like you said, with your like a murder mystery or something like that, like you expect somebody to die in the first chapter, or something like that, some dramatic inciting incident to occur, but that it doesn't happen here. So as a reader, if you're expecting that from a genre, you pick this out because of a certain anticipation of what it is you're going to receive as a reader. You're not going to get it here. So if you're new to Matthew FitzSimmons, I'm afraid you might drop this book down, and that's the risk you take.
Yeah, I think there is a good chance of that. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be something that is maybe 50-50 with people. They'll just start reading it and go, this doesn't really seem to be going anywhere, and it's not involving, and I'm not really seeing the plot from the off either. So
exactly,
I'm just going to throw this away. Whereas others who fall into it, and looking at it honestly, it feels like it has a kind of a pleasant literary style.
Yeah,
that maybe the people who read his stuff are just going to fall right into that.
Yeah, because it's not, you think world building, it's not overly heavy. Like sometimes you can get away with it in fantasy or some more hardcore sci-fi where the world building is really interesting. Like you're talking about spaceships, or you're talking about living on a different planet, or something along those lines, where the world building itself is kind of part of the action because it's the reader has to kind of they signed up for this. On this one, it's only set, I think, 2038. It's only like 15 or 20 years ahead of current time frame. There's really not a lot of science fiction-y stuff going on at the beginning. It's more just backstory about trying to understand who the main character is. And so that's another risk too. If you promise somebody a sci-fi and then you come out with the first 3 chapters where there really isn't a heck of a lot of sci-fi going on or action. So that's the struggle, I think, for me on this one. It's an interesting choice.
Well, good recall on the date there because it is 2038 in the setting. So I guess you get that get that little detail in there early, so people are like, okay, yes, it is a sci-fi. I bought the right book. And I can see Peter in the comments there. It sounds a bit like the clones in the film Moon. Yeah, it does kind of give me Moon vibes.
But it's a really cool story. That's the shame of it. It's like really, because by the time you get into it, there's a lot of quirkiness. Things like, a person was accused of divorcing his wife by killing her because he had a clone of himself, so he crashed the plane, so he would die and his clone would come back. That was just one of the offshoots. So it's like there's a lot of interesting like mental gymnastics like that, where like, oh, if I want to divorce my wife, the best way to do is to kill us both because I know she doesn't have a clone and I do. My clone will live without her. Then that's the easiest way to get out without paying her. So it's just stuff like that. That's kind of a cool thought. So it's a very, very interesting story. So, but
lots of setup for futuristic insurance fraud.
I guess.
And moving on to the next one, I just took a quick look at the point of view consistency to see how that laid out, because often with the highlights and everything and the helpful charting here, we can see whether we might be slipping up. And no, this looks pretty much spot on to me. It's definitely a third-person narrative.
Definitely a third-person narrative.
And we've got first-person and second-person indicators coming in there, usually through dialogue. Mm-hmm. And that's a really nice differentiation between the two. That looks absolutely perfect. Have you noticed anything odd with point of view or tense shifting as you've been reading it?
No, it was very consistent. The only odd part was when they start going from different points of view of clones and things of that nature. You have to be careful that you're making sure you're following one clone throughout the whole story and not bouncing viewpoints. Even though it's the same person, it's really a different person in the book. That's the only quite caveat. You got to be, as a reader, I get nervous sometimes. Like, am I still in the same person's head, or am I in the person's doppelganger? You know, you can't. You got to be careful, even though it's the same person. You got to stick with the same clone. Yeah,
I could see that being very tough. It's like, note to self: don't write about clones.
Yes.
And generic descriptions is always a fun one to look at here. So we're still in the word choice, and I think this is where we had a decent amount of indicators, but we're actually just around the average, a little above, but not too bad. And our greatest, most frequent generic descriptions looked good, maybe, and low. So again, not a huge spread, and I don't think a huge amount to really take care of here. So we have looked 140, maybe about 36. And of course, these can be easier to handle when you look through them, because if you check looked, it's like, did somebody literally look somebody dead in the eye? Yes. Okay, move on. That's a perfect, fine description.
Sure.
You're just not saying that something looked small or looked whatever. It's be specific, really, is where generic descriptions come in. But I don't think Matthew's really having a hard time with that at all. And then pacing. So, yeah, we did mention that, in our beginning here, the pacing is a little slower than one might generally expect from an opening. And you mentioned when we were coming on live here, Kevin, that you actually checked the pacing on just the opening.
I was curious because it was such a dramatic shift from the first three chapters to the next three. The first three chapters scored at a 24 or 25% slow-paced paragraph. So 1 out of every 4 was considered slow-paced in the first 3 chapters. The next 3 chapters were between 3 and 5%. So it was 5 times faster pace, according to this system, chapters 4, 5, and 6 versus 1, 2, and 3. So It was literally the action. It was literally, there was an inciting incident, and then off the story went. So you just had to get there. You had to, it was dramatic. And in addition to that too, I thought, well, this is really strange. I ran a readability test in the first 3 chapters. I don't know if you're going to go to readability next, but the first readability, the first 3 chapters scored a flesh reading ease of 71, and past the next 3 was an 80. So not only was it slow, he was more literary, had more flowery language. He had a little more difficult to read the first 3 chapters. Then all of a sudden it started the dialogue picked up, a lot more shorter words, easier to read and all that. So in addition to being faster paced, it was an easier read. So it was quite a big shift. It's pretty dramatic, actually.
I wonder if there's something in there where he's almost challenging you as a reader. Is like, I'm going to start slow and dense, and it's like climbing up to the top of the roller coaster before it goes down. That kind of thing is like, well, if you hold on,
yeah,
take you for a ride.
And that's one thing too with AutoCrit, as we talk about AutoCrit itself. It's not always a good thing to run your entire manuscript as a whole all the time, because some of these patterns inside, from chapter to chapter or section to section, can be hidden by like, oh, the overall pacing score, I don't know, what is it, 8% or something like that. But really the first 3 chapters were 25. And then it went to an 8. So there was a dramatic shift between chapter to chapter. So you got to be careful not only looking at the overall book, but also patterns between one section to the next, that you're not losing your readers in certain places.
True. And our summary here for the whole book, averages out at 7.8.
So you might look at that and say, oh, my pacing is perfect. I don't need to worry about it. If you just look at the whole of the thing, but you got to pay attention to, you see at the beginning right there, you see the whole dense section of red there on the left side of the chart. So you got to kind of dig into the details a little bit of okay, just because it's 8% doesn't mean it's great. You have to actually kind of focus in a little bit on it.
Yeah. You can really see it speeding up there as well. It's very, very dense beginning.
Yeah.
And then we're rocketing along here.
But like you said, that's obviously a style that he was shooting for in this work.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a kind of almost slow massage in, and then just blow it up, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, there's that theory too, that you have to establish what an average day is like for the main character before you throw it in the blender. So I mean, there's that way that it's more shocking when things actually start to, the twist actually happens, or the inciting incident becomes more impactful if you've already really hardcore established what status quo is.
Yeah, like see Ken mentioning, always seems in hard science fiction that the pacing always slows down as they describe the science in it.
Yeah,
I find that sometimes, I think I haven't read hard science fiction in a while because that kind of thing initially put me off it, just the density. Of that genre. I was like, this is just too slow and I'm not really interested in this. I think I just need to, for sci-fi, read stuff that's a bit less hard to go on to the easier side of it.
Stick with Andy Weir.
just get on with the action. I don't really care how the plasma pistols work exactly, but I think it's quite right. It would often by necessity slow down a little.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody loves this one, the initial pronouns and names. Anybody who's watching, if you can comment, remember our general, I don't want to say rules, but the number, if you can think off the top of your head of a percentage that we maybe got here in terms of initial pronouns and names. So that'd be how many percentage of sentences in the book that begin with a pronoun or character name. And I won't give away straight off what we generally find or what we generally don't find. But if you want to make a guess, feel free as well, Kevin.
I didn't look at this one. I would guess it's fairly high. I'm thinking it's in the 50s. 55. Ooh,
brave man. We generally don't see much above 50.
I was wrong.
Yeah, we're on 40. So we're sometimes I think usually what we kind of see is between 30 and 50. So
I guess that makes sense because this was a pretty strong third-person narrative where they didn't switch. There wasn't any head hopping that I could really recall a lot of. So I guess they didn't really need to focus so much on the initial pronouns.
Yeah, it can be tougher in a first person for sure. Mm-hmm. I know a good number of people have said to me over the years, I don't like writing in first person because using the word I all the time.
Yeah,
it's just I. You do have to work harder to stop that from happening in a first person. Otherwise, it can be up here in the 60s or something. And we generally do not see above 50 happening.
Yeah,
You got to keep it varied.
If you're playing Game of Thrones, even if it's third person and you bounce head to head, then you always have to introduce like the first, the first name or whatever. So you have to know who's speaking all the time. So you always have to add that in there.
Yeah, if you have a cast of 63 people.
Yes.
Sentence starters, similar one to our initial pronouns and names, just using, words that are connecting here. So we're either going to use an ing verb or a conjunction starting the sentences. 9.58%. I think most books that we look at are probably somewhere between 4 and 7 or 8. So this isn't a huge amount off there. I think for a 100 and what did you say, 102,000 words?
Yeah, 102.
Something like that. I think this, this doesn't alarm me at all.
No.
Now we can see which ones we're using just here as well. So Nothing great. Certainly the word but. He likes to start sentences with but. But that's fine. We're not going to wag our finger like the old school English teachers and say, you may not start a sentence with a conjunction. It's fine now. Calm down.
Bringing back horror memories in my mind, though, Gareth. Or and was the other one. You can't start a sentence with and. That's what they always told me.
But or and. It's like never ever. It's the sound of a wooden ruler just smacking off a desk. And repetition. I like to look at phrase frequency here. I just brought this one up as a quick little look, just to help some people if you're using this phrase frequency to see what's really going on. I always like to. This is one little tip that our dear friend Beth actually taught me, what she likes to do, and it turned out to work a lot better for me as well, is looking at phrase frequency and going for the longer ones. Either the 3-word or the 4-word are going to be your big ones that you don't want showing up too often. A lot of these are absolutely fine, 3-4 instances, but of course we get to the other Constance Darcy, 53.
Yeah, because that's the name they gave her clone, the other Constance. So
yes,
it said the other Constance because it's a little bit of unwieldy to have to read that all the time when someone's speaking, to have to see that big phrase being a person's name. But it's a necessity, I guess.
And I don't want to bounce too much around this manuscript again because we'll head into dangerous territory there.
Yeah.
But for example, a lot of these ones here, no choice but to, or the day after Christmas, they're fine. They're not actually, you would be looking out for places where you had that same phrase appearing like 3 or 4 or 5 times, in quick succession. The only one that really stood out to me as doing that was the other Constance Darcy, because that happens, but it happens in extended lines of dialogue because it's the name that's given to the clone.
Yes.
So there's no other way around it. I guess he could have come up with a nickname or something like that to use instead.
Yes.
But it doesn't really matter all that much.
It's interesting because he used Con as the name of the main character, as you see the first sentence there, as second sentence as Con, right? And then he mentioned the author mentioned Constance Darcy. The other Constance Darcy was the name of the other one. So I think he could have got away with Con and Constance. To be honest with you, I think he could have pulled that off instead of having to use the word the other and the first and last name.
He could have used con and non-con.
Maybe. Anything but that, because it was when I was reading it, it's like, I gotta read this because it becomes frustrating because like when you say said an ass or a character's name, a lot of times they literally disappear into the page and your eye glances over them. That's the whole point of using said an ass, right? But when you have that long of a phrase, it's unusual. It catches you every time. It's like friction as you're reading across the page after a while, like because it doesn't really give anything to you other than trying to describe who's speaking. But it's a long way to do that, so it becomes tiring to the reader. At least it did to me.
And this is where I thought things were quite interesting for me, especially talking with our initial genre discussion as we got started this evening.
Yeah,
it's just like, what is it? Is it here there? So we checked out the power words here, and we see take a little look at our spread. It's quite an interesting one. So we've got a predominant number of fear-based words here leading the way. Encouragement, which of course always shows up in any kind of story, really. That's the words that are driving things ahead and moving forward. So we have fear and encouragement. Caught up quite quickly there we have greed, the forbidden showing up there. Obviously we've got experimentation and all this going on. And lust falling in there as well, kind of equal to the forbidden and almost level pegging with forbidden. And I think those combined really to me, along with greed, I think the lust, greed, and the forbidden all come together to make me think of like a mad scientist.
Yeah.
And I think that's a core part of the story, is this guy, as you were saying, is potentially doing all sorts of things.
And the greed plays a big role in it as well, because there's a money factor, because it costs so much money to create your own clone. So there's a lot of stuff in there about poor people versus the rich, and people are billionaires that have money to clone themselves. So if they die, that you'll never really die type thing. If you have enough money, you can live forever. So it's a little bit of an interesting thing. But as you see from here, there was a lot going on in this story that I was reading. There wasn't a central theme. How's that sound to it? That, like I said, it wasn't all one or the other. So it was very difficult to kind of pinpoint what the angle was going here. It was very entertaining, but it was like there was just a lot going on. It wasn't a central focus.
Yeah, it seems quite a spread. I thought it looked more thriller than I expected, as well. Looking at the sci-fi, but I certainly get the kind of scientist angle there. And like you're saying, there's almost something in this spread because if we keep encouragement over here for now, but really just look at the right column here where most of our things are, is it's almost revealing a thematic sense of the story. When I look at that, I think of, okay, well, there's probably some kind of scientist guy who's again, the theme is saying something about wanting to live forever and messing around with the nature of things and all of that, especially for personal enrichment or personal betterment. So if that rings true, then excellent. And we had to get to readability. Our overall flesh score averages out at 79. So we're very close to that 80. I think, as you said there, maybe the beginning might kind of drag it down a little.
Yep. And again, that's one of those reasons why I always recommend even chunking your book up a little bit and checking different sections for different patterns in that sense. Is there a spot that you're really going to trip your reader upon? So don't always look at the overall all the time. I think you can get lost sometimes in our stats.
Yeah, and 79 is a good place to be. Mm-hmm. I think, as we said before, you kind of, nowadays for commercial fiction, you're kind of aiming for 80. But 79, that's not a world away from that. It's absolutely fine. So clearly a very readable, a piece of commercial fiction, despite the slow beginning. And finally, we did a little comparison to science fiction. And the score, as you may, I know we all love to cheer when we run something and it jumps like 15 points into elsewhere. Unfortunately, this one does not, but it does go up a little. So we're up from 72.5 to 73.8. A little bit of a bump. And that's probably, to my mind, going from general fiction to that and having a small shift, usually to me means something that is strongly written, but in a certain defined style. And when I'm looking at, even just the intro here of this novel, it seems that FitzSimmons definitely has his own literary style. I think it's just very, very tight. It
begs us to insert him as his own author in the system at some point here in the future.
It does,
because it's like, when I was reading, I'm like, this is not really science fiction. It's not really a thriller. It's, I think it actually falls pretty well into general fiction, to be honest with you. I think that almost is a good category for it at this point.
Just like a little something for everyone.
Yeah.
We'll have a look at some final statistics here just to round it out. If we go through our summary report, see if there's anything else that we missed that might be interesting. So 100,000 odd words, 10 average words per sentence, which is in line with what we generally see, isn't it? Most commercial fiction now, we got about 9 or 10.
Yeah, it's just around the 10, maybe just a hair below 10.
Words per paragraph average is 33. That's a little higher.
Yeah, and that
should lead to this.
Yeah, and the first 3 chapters, the average word per paragraph was 56 or 58. So that's where it was a dramatic shift.
Oof. There we got our consistencies. We looked at those with dialogue tags. We're very low on cliches, and certainly redundancies is tiny. We had a look at repeated and our word frequency. Con.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's interesting too, because he doesn't repeat a lot of times when you see the word frequency and the phrase frequency, you see a lot of some phrases really jump out. He really only had the character's name. Obviously, you could put that in the words to exclude, but it's very well written from a word selection point of view. I felt like there wasn't a lot of internal repetition of the same thing.
Yeah, quite right. Looking at that, because we haven't excluded any of the character names for this one, and that's really all that pops out, really, isn't it? Throughout all of here, well, except for clone, but everything else is looking like a character name, which makes for very, very varied narration.
Yeah. And
our phrase frequency gets a little more open, but Con said, Con had. There's the other Constance.
My favorite.
Other Constance to RC.
Yeah.
So that's still very varied as well. There's nothing dominating this, so to speak. So
usually it's around dialogue, as he's, like I mentioned earlier, as he's trying to reiterate who's speaking and who's doing something. In this one, that's very, very important, just by the nature of the clones.
All right, fabulous. And that is, or was, let me make sure that my screen didn't just go black completely.
Oh, you're good.
Yes, that was Constance by Matthew FitzSimmons. Any final words, Kevin?
No, I would recommend to take a look at this one, but I would treat it with a 10-foot pole, to be honest with you, just with the style, especially if you're a beginning author or just because this is something I think would be difficult to pull off. What he tried to do here, just the complex nature of a little bit of the subject line, and how he started it. I think it's something that maybe you could. It's almost like a lesson to read about how authors what you can get away with when you have a avid readership, avid audience that's going to buy your work and really bought into what it is you're delivering, versus trying to break into the scene and gather new audience. There wasn't much of a hook at the beginning, so it's just one of those things you can, if you want to take a look at it. Not saying not how to do it, but just. Boy, I think a lot of people out there, I wish I could get away with this, with my next novel, because it's good as an author because you can write kind of what you're feeling. You want to, a lot of telling at the beginning and building, world building and whatnot. But I think you're taking a big risk on trying to pull this one off.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those. It could be very polarizing.
Yeah.
Looking at Amazon reviews for the book, I think it has been, quite frankly. But that's always tough when it gets to these, the big #1 authors who release thrillers and they just explode. It's difficult because in any case, loads of people aren't going to like it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of difficult just looking at reviews to see why that may be. And it may be that many just couldn't really stick it through the opening.
Yeah. It's a tough one. It's a little bit of a tougher read. It's very interesting though. I really enjoyed it, but boy, it takes a little bit of effort, and not the kind of effort people are like, oh, it's science fiction. You got to take it some, but it's not. The science fiction wasn't the hard part about it. It was all the other stuff. So that's for me. That was the thing. I don't mind reading. Trying to figure out the physics of something or something. That'd be interesting to talk about. But it wasn't that at all. So it's an interesting one. So. I think it's a good way to run it through AutoCrit, because this is something that the system can really show you. It's not, maybe you think it's fine, but you run it through like maybe I should make a change, because I think the story could have been amazing and even been better if they had tweaked a few things and not just switch the timeline around. Really, it's more of a timing thing. The structure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, definitely that's it. Constance, check it out, and well, of course, if you've been here. Know what you're in for.
I just said, yeah. Peter asked me if it was worth an Audible credit. Well, I don't know. You might fall asleep on the road if you're listening to it and you're driving at the beginning.
Your mileage may vary, quite literally. Alrighty, thank you all for coming.
All right, thanks everybody.
We'll see you next time with another author. Hopefully, I think next month for October we'll be doing a horror novel. Frankly, it'll be close to Halloween, so we'll be back then with something new. But as usual, just make sure you're subscribed to the channel, like it, and as we mentioned before, if you have any books that you'd like to see dissected here on What's the Score, pop it in the comments. Let us know. We'll put it on the list, and hopefully going forward as well, we'll have Matthew FitzSimmons in the system at some point. So
yeah,
we'll hopefully soon. Alrighty, thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.